Materials for software delivery security. My name is Mark Levy, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. I focus on product marketing here at OpsMx. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. The session's going to be about 45 minutes long. We are recording the session. We'll send the session out and the slides to everybody. And if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. We'll answer all the questions, as many as we can get to. I'd like to introduce Bob Boulay, VP of Product Management here at OpsMx. Bob is a technology enthusiast with a passion for technology and making things work, along with a knack of helping others understand how things work. He's got over 20 years of solution engineering and product management experience. He's an expert in software delivery and DevSecOps. And he's definitely known for his dynamic and interactive style. Bob, how are you?
I'm hanging in there, my friend. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you.
You got it.
All right. So let me jump right in, guys. I think as Mark had indicated, any of the questions that you guys have, please put them in the chat. If for some reason I don't have time to answer them or can't answer them, I'll certainly follow up with you directly. Now that we've got the welcome out of the way, I just want to run us through a quick agenda for what the next, 45 minutes is going to look like. One of the things that I want to establish here is sort of defining what the delivery bill of materials is, right? So for a lot of folks, this is sort of a new concept. We're all familiar with what the software bill of materials is and what the software or SBOM looks like. But I want to talk about the delivery bill of materials, introduce you to that, sort of understand how they're different, right? So they're not mutually exclusive. I think they're both, from our perspective, both critical and a critical part of the software manufacturing process and the software deployment process. And then, talk a little bit about why it's critical. Why is the delivery bill of materials, why is it becoming critical to security and compliance teams? So we'll take some time to talk about that. And then, talk a little bit about how does one build a delivery bill of materials? Like where would I start, right? Or what would I do? Or what are the concepts and how is that brought together? Then, I'm going to take you through a tour of the thing itself, right? So we're going to look at a delivery bill of materials through our secure software delivery tooling. So I'll go ahead and walk through that. And then we'll wrap it up with, sort of how DevOps and DevSecOps teams can leverage a delivery bill of materials. Sort of what are the practical reasons why you should have one, right? And who should care, right? So, and then like I said, we'll leave some time at the end for questions as we go through it. So let's jump in. So what is the delivery bill of materials? So when we think about the delivery bill, it's really a comprehensive accounting of all of the security, compliance, and validation checks and actions that are taken in association with a given software deployment. So really, it's looking at all the things that have gone on, not just the contents, which is going to be our SBOM, right? But all the things that have taken place from the moment that code is checked in and the checks that it goes through there, through the build process, and then once the artifacts are generated, sort of what checks happen there, and then ultimately into the deployment stage, and ultimately what checks go on at that phase, right? So if we think about this, you can take these four categories, and some might argue, and we're talking about it internally as well, if test and QA need its own, and we've sort of put some of that in here as we sort of refine the definition of this. But I think we've settled on, for an initial piece here, these four stages, and really sort of documenting what goes on during these four stages. So as some examples, looking at source code, and we'll actually see a live example of this as we walk through some of the mock-ups and some of the screen captures that I've taken in the product. But any of the dynamic or static code analysis checks, things like branch protection and validation, code review validation, when we think about source code. Now, the system that's generating this bill of materials, or this delivery bill of materials, doesn't have to perform these checks, but it does have to integrate with the systems that are performing these checks to be able to understand what those results were, and ultimately catalog those results and determine whether or not the policies that are being enforced, or the rules engine allows for the results of those things to allow the build to move forward. When we look at things like build validation, we need to tie into the build system, CI validation and unit test coverage validation. So the types of things that happen within the build system, we want to make sure that we're capturing and documenting as part of that delivery bill of materials. Artifact validation. So we start getting into dependency checks, right? And sort of the efficacy of some of the dependencies that were brought in. Have they changed since the last deployment? And then ultimately vulnerability assessments. So as we look at an artifact and look at scanning that artifact, or bringing in data from tools like Sneak or others that will do these scans, and ultimately make an assessment and document the vulnerability assessment to make sure that, again, the ultimate goal here is to be able to bump this up against a set of rules to determine whether or not this is fit for distribution or fit for deployment. And then, when we do things like deployment validations, looking at things like sys benchmark checks, deployment performance validation. So for those of you that are doing things like canary releases, or want to go ahead and actually make sure that, this system is tied into something like Prometheus or Datadog, as you've done that initial deployment, you want to make sure that it's performing the way it's supposed to. So you're doing things like log analysis to determine whether or not there are any errors or any problems with that particular deployment. And then approval validation. So what mechanism was used to actually obtain approvals, and were those approvals manual, were they automated, but documenting those approvals as part of that deploy stage. So again, when we think about what that delivery bill of materials is, it's really an accumulation of all of this data to sort of represent the efficacy of this given deployment that's going to go out. Now, again, the challenge here, and we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about this, is how do I do this at scale? How do I do this to make sure that when I'm going to do a release, that this stuff's being accumulated and assessed, and the building out of this bill of materials is happening automatically. Doing this, obviously, from a manual perspective, would be really difficult, right? It would require a lot of data consolidation that would have to happen manually. So again, just that overview of sort of what this is what I wanted to accomplish on this slide. And that's our baseline for the rest of our presentation. All right. So let me just, there we go. The delivery bill of materials versus the software bill of materials. So this is something that we get all the time, right? So in the title of this is going beyond the software bill of materials. I personally am a believer in the fact that these things need to coexist, right? You need to have a software bill of materials, especially this day and age where so much open source is being brought in. There's an efficiency in terms of development to make sure that you're writing code that is required for your application, and then libraries that are needed to actually facilitate that can be, that are already out in the open source community, can be brought in. However, getting to a place where you have that comprehensive software bill of materials is sort of phase one of the approach, right? Because now you sort of know of the things and of the dependencies and of the bits that are being brought in, what their status is, right? Who the publisher was, how is it licensed? Is it a verified or known source? Are there vulnerabilities associated with it? Now, what we are suggesting is that gets folded into and made part of the delivery bill of materials. So, and again, if you think what we're doing here, we're just widening the aperture of our scope to look at the entire deployment, right? We're not just looking at the tactical and saying, what are the packages that make up this deployment? And we're also not suggesting that that's not important. It's also in conjunction with that, let's widen the aperture of our scope. Let's look at multifaceted checks, both software and environment. Let's focus on all the elements of deployment. Let's focus on, the source code, the compiling and the CI, along with the unit tests, the artifact scanning and the artifact assessments, and then ultimately that deployment methodology and that deployment environment. So again, I think if we look at this and we say, hey, the software bill of materials fits into that either source or artifact reporting, and that check can happen. That check is vital, right? But that check can happen, and then ultimately gets folded into that delivery bill of materials. Again, giving us a much more comprehensive view of this thing from as it relates to going from the fingertips of your software engineers all the way out through the deployment, right? So I think, you know, the idea behind this is we're also introducing this concept that security and validation doesn't stop at the code check-in, right? It's those shift left policies in terms of security and you know, implementing secure coding practices, all are things that are hyper important these days. But again, I think what we're suggesting here is through the delivery bill of materials, you're going to want or expect or need visibility beyond just what happens at that development phase. And so this is really what we're attempting to introduce here as we walk through sort of looking at that entire process end to end. There we go. Okay, so why is the delivery bill of materials you know, important, right? And I think, you know, this is something that, you know, from a security and a compliance perspective, and by the way, those are two of the main use cases here, right? Is that, you know, we not only want to make sure that we're extending security beyond the code commit, but there's a compliance element here as well. For those of you that may have gone through you know, a high trust audit or ISO 27001 audit, or doing things like FedRAMP, you know, most of the auditors there are show me kind of people, right? They want to look for your SDLC, they want to look for your documented policies, but the second half of that is they want proof that you're actually practicing what you preach. And that's really where I think the delivery bill of materials is going to come into play. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation in terms of the artifacts that could get generated or should be generated here that would allow you to go ahead and actually prove that out to a given auditor in the event that that should come up from a compliance perspective. But again, I think we're looking to ensure all checks are made and policies are adhered to, right? So at the end of the day, we're pulling data from multiple systems. Those systems are running a very specific set of checks at a very specific point in time. We are looking to consolidate that data as we build this delivery bill of materials and make sure that as it moves through the process, it continues to meet those requirements. And we look at the entire delivery process. So security and vulnerabilities, again, we're not looking to replace the tools that you have doing that. We're looking to tap into the data that those tools are providing. Same thing with, you know, your code quality tooling, static and dynamic code analysis, your unit test coverage, all the dependency validation that you need to do or that you're doing as part of what you're bringing in, whether it be, you know, runtime dependencies or static dependencies, you're bringing that stuff in. We want to make sure that those checks, the things that you're a part of your SDLC, those checks are actually happening and being enforced. I mentioned the software bill of materials. Again, I think the software bill of materials is a part of this whole thing. So bringing in that software bill of materials from the vendor of your choice, making it part of that delivery bill of materials and making sure that we're doing those checks and that we're doing the validation that's associated with the data that those tools are providing. And again, I think some of these other pieces, like things like approval documentation, whether or not your approval system is manual, like someone needs to come in and say, I want to review these 5 things, and then ultimately press a button and that will go ahead and approve this. Or, you know, if you're using something like OpsMx, you know, you can go ahead and actually automate some of those approval gates by evaluating policies and evaluating these things through a rules engine, and then ultimately automating that process. And then I think the other piece of this that we talked about is that deployment environment. So what has happened as part of that deployment, right? What types of tests were done? You know, did you do you know, deployment validation, so, you know, i.e. a canary, and then measure sort of where the risks were associated with that based on log checking or performance checking. What were the steps that were taken as part of that approval process? Who approved it? All of those things are a part of that. Ultimately, that last mile check, we want to make sure we're part of this. And so all this data is going to provide that end-to-end view. And again, I think, you know, it's really important to make sure that we're aligning this data and performing these checks at each step along the way, but also we're able to, as we'll talk about a little later, prove to an auditor that I did indeed, or we did indeed do all of this. And again, it doesn't have to stop. It shouldn't stop at the SBOM. It needs to go wider than that in terms of the entire delivery process. So this is also a question that we get quite a bit. How do I build this? Right? What's the secret sauce? Right? And I think, one of the things that I like to tell people is you really need to have the ability to tap into all of the information that's being generated by tools in your ecosystem, right? So most of us have built out an ecosystem. We've settled on, a security tool vendor, a code analysis tool vendor, a build tool vendor, a CD platform. We've settled on, deployment targets or a deployment type or a build type. So all of these things need to be tapped into, right? And I think, one of the ways to go about doing this, right, is to go system to system and assemble this information in sort of a single source of truth manually, right? Now, there's a couple of problems with that. One, it's manual in process, so it's going to prevent your scaling and your velocity, right? So if you try and go out and do all this stuff, the other thing you can do is you can, let the tools collect all that data, and then when you need to, run around at that time and sort of round it all up when the auditor is about to show up or whatnot. That doesn't seem very efficient either in terms of, sort of how to go about doing this. So really, OpsMx's position is you need sort of a centralized tool that is capable of tapping into and retrieving data from all of these tools in your infrastructure and ultimately making them available to a system that can then ultimately assemble that delivery bill of materials. And that system is something I'm going to walk you through today in terms of how to go about doing that. Some of the other benefits here of obviously collecting this information is you can centralize the process of the checks that need to be done, right? So again, a developer during code check-in is going to have to pass through, a security gate. But, the time between when that check-in happens and when things are compiled and go through CI and then ultimately deployed, you want to make sure you're reevaluating that along the way. Tapping into these tools is what's going to allow you to do that as a benefit beyond just generating the delivery bill of materials. So now I want to take you on a tour of what one of these looks like from our perspective. So if I come in here and take a look at, sort of what this would look like from our perspective, right? Now, as you can see here, we have built out this, and by the way, guys, I've hedged my bets here, and I'm using screen captures versus the live system. I always like to do that when I'm running a webinar. But if you do want to see a live demo of this, guys, or if you want to drill into this more outside of what I'm going to have time to show here today, I'd be absolutely happy to link up with you one-on-one and actually do that. But as we go through and look at this, there are our stages. There's our source stage, our build stage, our artifact stage, and our deploy stage. As you can see here in this particular case, I've connected the system up to SonarQube, and I'm bringing in the source code analysis piece. So I'm bringing that data in and, ultimately giving that a pass-fail. I'm linked up to GitHub, and I'm looking at my branch protection policy. So, basically what branch am I pulling from? That's ultimately going to be bumped up against a policy to make sure that that's allowed. I can actually bring in things like commit information and validate that here as well. That'll all be part of the deployment bomb. I'm looking at things like code reviewers and code source code provenance and secret scanning. All that stuff I'm tapping into GitHub to do. You may be doing it with a different system or a different source code system. That can, obviously should be tapped into as well to ultimately bring this information in. But ultimately, that source code piece and all the checks that I'm doing here are being brought to bear within this delivery bomb, right? Now, again, not only am I bringing this in to ultimately document this information, but as part of a secure software delivery system, I'm also bumping this data up against a rules-based engine or a policy-based engine to make sure that these things are within scope or within spec of what I've laid out as part of my SDLC. Now, The same thing goes for build, right? We're in this case here, it's going to shock you guys that we're using Jenkins as an example, but again, we're tapping into Jenkins. We're pulling the relevant information from the Jenkins system to make sure that we understand what's happening, and we're documenting the information from the build system and the CI system to make sure that we're bringing that in. Again, all about the efficacy of this particular deployment. The same thing with things like unit test coveraging, and that's something that I can set up a policy or a rules-based engine on to give this a pass-fail as well. But again, we're pulling this from SonarQube in this particular case. And then build pipeline validation, again, we're pulling that from Jenkins, and so we're bringing that information together to document that as well. Moving on to the next stage where it gets interesting is the artifact stage. So here, again, we're tapping into the different tooling. So in this case here, Aquasec Trivi, to look at things like the dependencies and ultimately, sort of what the situation is with the dependencies. And again, this pass or fail is, again, taking that data and bumping it up against a rules engine that we've built out that allows you to go ahead and create rules around determining what is a pass or fail here for this particular check. The same thing with vulnerability assessments. As I go through and look at the vulnerability assessments, and again, I'm taking these rules and codifying what's in my SDLC, and ultimately forcing something like OpsMx's secure software delivery while it's building the delivery bomb, ultimately to go ahead and evaluate this against these rules. And again, the idea behind this is, while this process is happening, this is dynamic, but once we hit the deploy stage, this becomes locked based on sort of what is actually in or what's actually happened. But again, we're tracking the efficacy of these things as we go through, and we go from point to point here in the process. And it's the same thing with deployment, right? So if I were to look at things like I've chosen sys benchmarks. So in this case here, I happen to be tapped into Spinnaker as a CD tool. That's not necessary, but that just happens to be what we've chosen here. And so we're looking at things like sys benchmark validation, deployment tool validation coming from Spinnaker. Down here, a delivery verification. So in this case here, I've used the OpsMx intelligent software delivery platform to actually do a canary deployment, and then ultimately tap into logs, metrics, and ultimately look at a quality score for that particular delivery. There's a lot of tools out there that can help do this. We can tap into those, but again, the idea that this was tested, there was a delivery verification that took place, and then ultimately documenting things like the approval validation. In this case here, it was a manual approval. The deployment window validation. So is this being deployed within the windows that have been set out by policy at the organization? So again, I think bringing all this together into that sort of end-to-end check to ultimately make sure that we have all the data that's associated with this. And then ultimately, what I want to do at that point is I want to be able to attest. So I want to be able to generate an attestation. So this system now becomes the system of record as it relates to the efficacy of this particular deployment. So in the event that I needed to go ahead and produce documentation for an auditor, for whether that be a compliance auditor or a security auditor, that I've got a documentation of what's actually happened during a given deployment. I can go ahead and actually generate this documentation here through this attestation of the actual deployment itself. And this is really just a makeup of everything that's in that delivery bill of materials. So again, guys, I think we're providing that sort of end-to-end view. We're documenting all those things. We're also, again, I think as part of this, taking the data that's collected to build that delivery bill of materials and bumping that up against a rules engine or a policy engine. The other part of this that I think I want to mention here real quick is, because I feel like it just would feel undone if I didn't discuss it, is things like exception handling. So, as I go through and I process this thing and I find at the artifact stage that there are critical vulnerabilities that need to be dealt with, I need to evaluate that from a security perspective, and I may decide, hey, my SDLC says I have 30 days to correct these things. However, this is not an exploitable thing based on the way I'm going to deploy it. I may want to set up an exception. So I could do things like exception handling here. Again, this is going slightly beyond the delivery bill of materials, but if that delivery bill of materials surfaces a problem, a system in which I can go ahead and actually manage all of those things or those exceptions that I might want to go down and ultimately make available. So that is really, from that delivery bill of materials, what this would look like. And again, I think, when we think about the construction of this, it really is an accumulation of all the data coming from all the systems that you've already put in place. We're just wanting to bring all that stuff together and help you organize that and ultimately make informed decisions about deployments, whether they be manual or automated. But again, documenting what happened during that deployment. So that is, again, a very, very quick tour of, sort of what that delivery bill of materials would look like. Let me go back to my slide presentation and then talk about how is this used, right? So I think at the end of the day, you guys might be sitting there thinking, great, Bob, thanks for showing me how to build that, but how am I going to use this, right? And how would I use something like this in my day-to-day operations? And I think, when we start thinking about this, as a data consolidator, we're providing a real-time view into a changing delivery landscape, right? So, the things that are affecting or impacting our software, it's a landscape that is ever changing, and it's not sundial style changes. Think stopwatch here. It's changing minute to minute, second to second in terms of what's out there in the wild. There's new vulnerabilities being discovered. There's issues that are happening outside, in the environment that you're going to deploy to that could potentially impact this. So being able to go ahead and actually track these things in real time and then ultimately consolidating them so you're not running from one system to the next. Consolidating alerts and making sure that you're getting alerts from a single source of truth, again, I think is critical. And again, I think, providing a window into that deployment process that can be shared with external stakeholders along with internal folks. You might need to share this with a customer. You might need to share this with an auditor. If you're a SaaS operator, there's a number of different reasons why you might need to do this. So again, I think that piece of this is really critical. And then for security teams, again, it's a window into that application deployment security posture, right? So if I look at this and say, hey, I've got a bunch of internal stakeholders that need a window into this. What I don't want to do is send them an email that says, here's how to log in at 15 different systems, right? What I'd like to be able to do is be able to say, hey, look, here's an attestation coming from our system, our I guess you could call it our DevSecOps control plane that consolidates all of the security information across the entire CI/CD ecosystem, and again creates simplicity and speed. Right. I think the idea behind a lot of this, guys, is if you don't have a way to bring all this data together and really act on this information, what you wind up with is bottlenecks, right? You have to choose between scale and speed and safety and security. And I think, being able to go ahead and bring this data together, being able to share it out, being able to document what it is that you've done, but more importantly, codify the decisions you've made from a policy perspective and ultimately enforce them, at each layer of the process while documenting all that stuff. And that's what I mean by real-time gating of releases. Ultimately, this delivery bill of materials is just not something that you're going to sort of hang on your wall. It's something that can be used in real time to make sure that we're gating releases based on compliance and we're gating releases based on security. And we're doing that in an automated fashion to allow us to go ahead and actually scale and deliver at a velocity that our customers expect us to deliver at. So with that said, guys, I think I got through that material a little faster than I thought I was going to, but I want to open it up for any questions or concerns or anything that you didn't see that you're hoping to. And by the way, feel free to reach out to me directly, or feel free to reach out to a member of the team here at OpsMx.
Did we lose Bob? Did I lose you? If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat. And we're also streaming into LinkedIn, so you can enter them in the LinkedIn comment section. Bob, can you hear me?
I think I dropped off there for a second. I apologize.
Okay, great. Hey, thank you very much. Yeah, we do have one question, and please, anyone else, enter in the chat in Zoom or in LinkedIn in the comments a question. And I think you touched on it on how the delivery bomb is constructed, but the question is how bomb metrics are achieved for elements of deployment. That is sort of the question. Maybe you could touch on maybe that a bit.
Yeah, and so it really depends, right? So it depends on sort of so for metrics, it depends on sort of, and I'm going to make the assumption here that when we talk about metrics and elements of deployment, that we're talking about sort of either canary-based deployment metrics or some sort of post-deployment metric that would allow us to establish the health of something as part of that deployment process. And I think there's a couple of things. If there's that one piece that could be it, or it could be, hey, how are you measuring the success or failure as part of the DBOM, right? And I think for that, it's really about policy and constructing your SDLC and understanding your organization's vision of what a safe deployment looks like. Those are all definitions that would come from within your organization, within your engineering organization or your product management organization or your operations organization, your SRE team. I think those metrics are part of sort of a policy building exercise that a lot of software manufacturers go through. And I think a lot of them sit down and say, what would be acceptable to our customers and what policies do we want to put in place? The problem with that is, when it comes to codifying those things and ultimately being able to say, hey, how are they enforced? And then ultimately, how do I get a snapshot of that they were indeed enforced, and how do I prove that? That is where I think we're going to come along and help you do that. But I think the metrics associated with that and the policies associated with that, again, there are a lot of secure delivery best practices out there. There's a lot of folks that, depending on the industries that they're in or the industries that their software is being deployed into, that will help derive some of those things. And then ultimately, you can then ultimately configure a tool like this to, ultimately say, let me pull that data, let me go ahead and actually publish a pass-fail as part of the delivery bill of materials. But then one step further is, let me gate this delivery. Let me ultimately gate this delivery based on whether or not those checks have passed. And then ultimately, if there's alerts that need to be sent based on what the system is using as it compiles or synthesizes the data that it needs to build that delivery bomb. These are the things that, again, the criteria by which we evaluate it is going to come from you, the customer, or you, the user of the software. Again, derived from sort of the rules of engagement that you're playing it within. So hopefully that answered the question. And if it didn't, please feel free to follow up with me directly. I'd be happy to have a discussion one-on-one.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is, the SBOM is like a nested inventory or a list of ingredients for software components. But when you look at like from a context of security and compliance, the view has to be more than that. It has to take into account all the artifacts and metadata with how those components are being delivered. And that's sort of what's missing, right? That's what we're trying to
Absolutely. Absolutely.
solve.
So yeah. And I think, I think, when you think about things like SBOMs, you think about tools like Black Duck or Sneak or other security tools, right? Those become inputs into the delivery bomb, because remember, we're widening the aperture of our scope here, right? Like, and it doesn't diminish the value of any of those things, right? But it's acknowledging that those things are part of a larger process, right? And it's the documentation of that process and the rules that are associated with that process that go beyond just the initial security checks, right? So again, if I'm compiling an SBOM based on a series of code check-ins, and I want to go ahead and actually compile a release, I'm going to get that information, and depending on the tooling you're using, you'll get various bits of information about the components that are being brought in, both runtime and transient dependencies, and sort of what's happening with those things. However, as the process moves from left to right, those checks continue to be important, right? And the processes that need to take place as that moves from left to right continue to be important. And I think capturing all that stuff, Mark, to your point, is really us basically suggesting that you widen the aperture of your scope when you're evaluating the quality of a deployment.
Yeah, it's sort of the epiphany of when, with infrastructure as code, when with DevOps, the practice said, hey, we need to version control everything, right? Not just our source code. It's sort of that same kind of concept. I'm curious too, is because the delivery is sometimes dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
and how that gets captured. Is it stateful and sometimes stateful? So I think there's some interesting perspectives there on how that gets captured, and sort of the visibility of capturing the delivery attributes. Um,
Absolutely, and I think this goes. This could not be any more true than in a true continuous delivery environment, right? So when I get to a place where, let's say, as an example, I might be a SaaS operator, right? The whole idea behind this is I want to deliver the innovations that are coming from the heads of my engineers and the whiteboards in my conference rooms out to a place where it's starting to add value to my customers, right? And so the ability to prove out the efficacy of each delivery at that velocity, right? Because it's very dynamic, right? It could be, anywhere from I'm deploying daily, hourly, weekly, minute by minute, I mean, depending on sort of what you're doing and how stateful or stateless your application is. But being able to enable and imagine what it would take to prove the efficacy of one of those releases if you didn't have a tool that sort of brought all that together and was able to automate the process of building a delivery bomb, right? You'd be going from system to system and sort of trying to pull information in, right? And I think that becomes a critical part of any type of work that you want to do around validation or around compliance and proving to an auditor that you're following those best practices. I can't tell you how many ISO or high trust audits that I've been through where the auditor will look across the table at you and smile and say, that's great. I love the fact that you've got these policies in place, but show me that you're following them, right? Anybody can haul themselves up in a room for an hour and a half and come up with a great SDLC. It's the enforcement of that and the ability to prove it out, I think, and being able to do that at scale, right? So either in a dynamic or more static environment where maybe you do quarterly shipments, to customers, and that's a little bit more, sort of static. But again, I think when you look at the dynamic nature of true continuous delivery, this becomes a real challenge.
yeah, hey Bob, we got another question in from our LinkedIn audience. Michael asks about industry or government groups that are perhaps supporting or starting to think about this kind of standard of a DBOM, and who's committing to it if possible, or do you see this primarily, and you've, I think, talked about this with your slide, but do you see this primarily for internal security and compliance versus customers and auditors? So there's probably a couple
So
questions there.
yeah, no, that's great. I think that I'll tackle the last part first. So I think when you look at this thing and you look through it from the system level, or the level that I was providing a walkthrough of, that really becomes your operational view into the delivery bomb, right? Because you're interested in those details. Plus, there's an interactive nature of it, right? Like I may need to, look at an alert and say, hey, I'm going to create an exception here because while I agree this needs to be dealt with, I want to create a time-boxed exception for this so that I can allow this deployment to go through. Someone authorized to do that can do that. So this, I think the system that we're using today or that we're building today to do this is very, very dynamic in that it's going to allow you to do all of those things to sort of manage through the DBOM, manage the deployment. Now, when it comes to outside customers or auditors, right? That's where the generation of the attestation comes in, right? Where I can go ahead and actually download an attestation report that says, here are all the things that happened. And if I go and I deliver, an auditor 100 or 1,000 of these things and give them the ability to sort of manually or randomly go through and check, they'll have all the information that they need there to be able to do that, right? So I think that's sort of where we see this being applicable both from an outside looking in and from an inside looking out perspective, right? I also think that this might be valuable for SaaS operators who need to prove the efficacy of their process to their customers. More and more SaaS operators are getting some really hard questions from security teams, right? They want to know, what are you doing? Especially ones where there's any sort of data custody or any sort of it's a stateful application. They want to know sort of how these things, what safeguards you're taking. And so making that part of the conversation is also another use case for this. As far as standards and others, I think we're at early days here for that. I think as we sort of flush this out and we start to sort of really sort of introduce this to our customer base, I think a natural progression of this, I can see this as a natural progression of saying, hey, we want to approach standards boards, we want to approach and make this part of the taxonomy of and a certification process. We just haven't gotten there yet, but I think it's something that's in the back of our minds.
Right. And by the way, there's, you got the SBOM, but there's the whole bomb concept is, sort of exploding.
Yes.
There are
Yes.
several
Yes.
others. So this, in different contexts. Bill Turner has a question. What is the work effort to get up and running? I mean, how does this get implemented typically, Bob?
So for us, it's relatively simple, right? So for us, it's simply a deployment of the OpsMx secure software delivery tooling within your environment, and then ultimately using the integrations that we've built. And by the way, we're essentially an integration factory here, right? So we're building new integrations every day to the tooling that you have, and then ultimately, depending on whether or not you're hooking it up to an existing CD system, or you just want to bring in the tooling to build the DBOM, depending on the level of control you want over the delivery process using our tool. It's simply a matter of going through and saying, hey, I want to integrate with Sneak, or I want to integrate with SonarQube, or I want to integrate with Trivy, and then ultimately we'll leverage the APIs that are associated with that integration to start pulling that information in. And then on the back end, we're using a graph database to ensure that we're able to go ahead and actually scale as we start to pull all this information in. And then ultimately it results in what you saw there in the UI, where we're ultimately starting to put all that information in place. So the setup is relatively minimal. I think, of course there is some setup, and I think, not only do we, are we able to sort of walk you through or guide you through that, but we also offer professional services around being able to set that up for you if you need it as well.
All right, great. Well, right on the money as far as time. Any final questions? And please reach out to Bob or myself here at OpsMx if you have any other questions. We really appreciate your time today. This was our first live stream on LinkedIn. I really like it. We're streaming both in LinkedIn and Zoom, so we'll continue to do that. Bob, thank you so much. I think this is a really interesting area that really moves the bomb forward in security and compliance. And
Excellent.
everybody, thank you, everybody. Have a good day wherever you are, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks
Okay?
all. Take care.
Bye-bye.